was there ever a time where bonds were used for a valid need at a time, and then they would all go to mature and be paid off, and the government would be square and everything would be okay? Because I feel like we're at a time now where bonds are almost like me paying off a credit card with a new credit card, and then get another credit card, pay off another credit card. Sure. And it feels like we're now in a world where you can see these sovereign currencies are Ponzi's.
Of course they are, and but they always have been.
There was never a time when they'd run a surplus and pay it off.
Okay, yes, there was. So during my lifetime and your lifetime, Bill Clinton paid down debt. He actually shrunk the size of government. During my lifetime, he's the only U.S. president who has done that. And by the way, I think that's why, in my personal opinion, there have been 2 decent presidents in the United States in my lifetime, and he's one of them for that reason. Huh. In spite of all of the controversy, he shrunk the size of government and paid down debt. We had a surplus. We were running a surplus for several years. And it actually, ironically, created problems in the financial markets because the U.S. Treasury wasn't issuing treasuries. And in the financial markets, you're piling debt on top of treasuries, right? And if you don't have enough treasuries, then you can't create all that credit inside the securities industry. So that during our lifetime, we've actually had some. Now, he didn't pay down all the debt. He just paid down some of it because U.S. was running a surplus for several years during his presidency. But during my lifetime, and I'm 54 years old, there's been one president that actually paid down debt. But if you go back deeper in U.S. history, there were several who did. And there was the Great Depression of 1920 that nobody talks about, because the Great Depression that everybody reads the heartbreaking history of came after that. But in 1920, after World War I, everybody was absorbing the war, right? Britain went off the gold standard. And then after the war, it went back on the gold standard at the original pre-war price. However, there had been so much debt that had been piled on top of the British economy that when they went back to the pre-war gold price, it was deflationary, right? So there was a depression, and that reverberated all around the world, even though the world was not as interconnected back then. But nobody talks about the Depression of 1920. Why? Because it lasted 9 months. It was as deep as the Great Depression in terms of both unemployment and GDP correction, but it happened fast. And why did it happen fast? Why didn't it just drag on and on and on like the Great Depression did? Because the central banks weren't trying to fight it. They were actually, the president back then actually paid down debt instead of trying to figure out how to, let's, do QE, let's expand the size of the central bank, let's try to keep interest rates low. There was no manipulation of the free market whatsoever. And the US government paid down its war debt during that period of time, and it was over fast. It was brutal, but it was over fast.
Don't avoid pain. Just allow markets to act like markets.
Well, but right now, everyone just takes for granted. They think the US has a free market, but of course we don't. The most important price in any economy is the price of borrowing money, because that's the traffic signal for capital allocators to allocate capital across time, as in short-term versus long-term, or across industries. And the most important price is the most manipulated price.
Well, so what is a good price of capital? Because we know 0% interest rates are a bad signal.
Makes no sense.
They distort markets. But also we know if it was 20%, people wouldn't be able to afford to borrow to build businesses. Is it like an ideal?
I don't know what that is, and I don't pretend to have the knowledge. This is the Hayekian pretense of knowledge. Nobody knows what the real price of interest would be. And if we let currencies freely trade and let interest rates freely trade, and the central banks do what they did in 1920, just step back and stop manipulating, then we'll find out what it is. But one thing we do know is that time preference really does matter. A human being, all else equal, would rather have something today than tomorrow, right? So it takes discipline to save and put off your consumption to tomorrow. So we would rather have consumption today if given a choice. So what does that mean? It means by definition, there is a value to time. And it means, therefore, there is a time value of money. And therefore, that means interest rates will always be positive. And the yield curve will be a natural, unmanipulated yield curve would naturally be upward sloping. And you would never have negative interest rates.
This is the pleasure trap. Somebody wrote to me once, they said, you need to read a book called The Pleasure Trap. Because I've always tried to lose weight and I never do. And it's all about decision-making. And, it's that short, it's a time preference thing.
Absolutely.
It's exactly the same. Everything you really want in life takes discipline.
You're right.
Because you have to put time to it, like a good physique, looking good, saving money, all these things. But we've constructed a society that gives us instant pleasure at the touch of a button, whatever we want. Coffee?
Right.
If this was 20 years ago, my mum would be up there making a coffee. No, Starbucks, someone will deliver it to us.
Right, you had it delivered. All of a sudden, Danny brought me a second coffee.
We'll pay $25 for 3 coffees rather than just make. But this is the pleasure trap. It's interesting because over the length of doing this podcast, you get these realizations, these things that come to me at certain times. And I had one recently where I was talking to Steve McClurg about this, who we were at dinner with last night, was that when I was younger, when I was in my 20s and 30s and had no kind of concept of time, I was always thinking about how I make money, how I build wealth.
Right.
What could I do? What businesses could I set up? What jobs could I do? Over the last couple of years, and I think this is a combination of age and doing this job, I now think a lot more about wealth preservation.
Yes, sure. Because you have something to preserve.
Yes. Yeah. And I have dependents to look after.
Right.
And so I think about that a lot now. And what's come off the back of that is this kind of separate realization of this separation of money and state. Yes, I've always been as a Bitcoiner, I believe it. But I've actually come to that realization, like a strong realization, because I met somebody in Colombia who was a Venezuelan who'd lost everything through inflation.
Oh my gosh, yes.
And I was out in Lebanon and I met and Argentina, all these places I've been, I've met so many people who had everything they worked for their entire life wiped out. And honestly, if that happened to me, Caitlin, I'd be devastated.
Of course you would.
Because the devastation would be for what it can do for my family, but also as all that expended energy over this last 2.5 decades when I've worked would have been for nothing.
Correct.
And so I think about that a lot now. And because of that, one, I obviously have tactics and tools I use, but I also have this massive disdain for the people who have no respect for the hard work of others, the idiots within government, within central banks, who just make policy decisions without thinking about the dire impact that this has on millions and millions of people.
Correct. Right. Yeah, absolutely. That's why I would never want to be in that position. I just did an interview with Max Raskin, and his interviews are always quirky, and he just throws crazy questions at you that, you've never been asked in an interview. And we were talking about exactly this. He was trying to push me for why I'm not getting involved in politics and why wouldn't you want to be in a government position. And it's exactly that reason. I don't want to tell people what to do with their money, and I don't want to be in a position of I don't believe, let's put it this way, I don't believe the financial system is stable, and I wouldn't want it to collapse on my watch. So why would somebody who has espoused solvency and strong capital structures for her entire 15-year career post the financial crisis, who has dedicated herself to finding a better, more stable financial system, walk in to an unstable system and take responsibility for it? It makes zero sense. And so a lot of people will say that on Twitter, like, well, why aren't you, in a position of power? And I absolutely don't want it. Thank you. And so but it's funny, we were just chatting before we started, right? There are two presidential candidates, both of whom you interviewed yesterday, right? Who are here at the North American Blockchain Conference, and they're both hardcore Bitcoiners. And they get it. They get the philosophy behind it. They also get the utility behind it of faster payments and faster settlement, a more stable financial system. They totally get it. And they're both really curious people. And I've met them both. And they are, I will say, both of them have very special minds. It's not an accident that some of the smartest people ended up early Bitcoiners. And it's because a lot of us figured a lot of this out. And I don't put myself in that category. I certainly, the most important people in this space are, well, you do. The most important people in this space are the software developers, and I am not that. I'm just trying to open the door to allow their great creation to be adopted by more people, because we knew that the regulatory state was going to be an attack vector on it. And so I'm trying to get that door open, and it's taken longer than I expected. But I was having a chat with Trace Mayer not too long ago.
Oh, how is Trace?
He's great. He's doing great. And he said, it's going about as fast as I expected it to. Remember, his sixth network effect was financialization, and the seventh network effect is global reserve currency. We're at number 6 on his network effect, and he's like, it's going about as fast as I expected. So it's nice to hear his perspective on that.
His name comes up regularly, and he's desperately missed.
He is. He really is. But he's doing well. He hasn't moved on from Bitcoin. He's just gone out of the public,
the limelight.
Eye. Yeah.
Well, I understand why people say, Caitlin, why aren't you going into politics? Because they know you'll be brilliant at it. They know your perspectives, but you kind of have anyway in the other way. You can do it the other way. You can be on the sinking ship and try and change it, or you can build the life rafts for people. And that's what you're doing with Custodial, which we'll certainly get into. But yeah, so this whole realization of this whole financial system, it's been a real challenge, because it starts to make you question, well, what should I be doing with my time? Like you've been doing. What should I be doing? How do I teach people? And I've become very despondent with politics.
Of course.
Very despondent with politics.